I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Nā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. I rise to support this bill with the Green Party supports it to Select Committee. Look, it's in one sense a non-controversial bill, but there are some concerning aspects within it. Really what we're debating tonight should be three separate pieces of legislation, not this omnibus bill, because it deals with incredibly different parts. The first is the new Netflix tax, the second is new information and contact detail disclosure from the Australian government to the New Zealand government when it comes to student loans, and the third is the bright line test, the capital gains tax, when you don't want a thing called a capital gains tax. So, Mr Speaker, we'll be supporting. We want to hear the discussion around the Select Committee. We want to hear from the diverse group of experts and people involved in these three different areas. When it comes to the new Netflix tax, I remember John Key's promise at the last election, no new taxes. And I guess you can make an argument this is a new tax. I guess you could make an argument it's an extending an existing tax into areas that's not currently being taxed. Here's, I guess, David Seymour voting for increased taxes, I assure, tonight. Now, Mr Speaker, there's a legitimate debate here because New Zealand retailers do feel like they're not on a level playing field. The IRD reports they're missing out on around $180 million of revenue per annum. So the questions are, why is the government going after only this part, which is 40 of that $180 million of revenue? Now, the Green Party supports our domestic retailers. We've called for this in the past. But we would also note some questions around the compliance costs. Obviously, this has been the reason this hasn't been enforced by previous governments was that the 400 de minimis threshold, which isn't being looked at in this legislation, was always seen as a challenge because sure, the government would love that extra revenue from the GST receipts on those products. But what's the point if you're actually spending more getting that revenue? So I guess the government's thought they've found a bit of a workaround with having the onus on the provider of goods and services. I'm thinking of Netflix, of Amazon. Now the questions here are we simply going to drive these providers of services to New Zealanders who obviously they want because they're subscribing, for example, Netflix, and I'm a Netflix subscriber myself, will we in fact see a perverse effect that these companies, because they feel they're not on a level playing field to other maybe smaller competitors under that $60,000 GST threshold, they'll in fact leave our market? Now what we could in fact see is our New Zealand customers, consumers, poorer as a result. A second concern is whether we've got that $60,000 threshold right. Should it be lowered to, I've seen $10,000 provided. I think it's an interesting debate to be had around the Select Committee table. And thirdly, and I think this is quite an incredibly worrying clause, is around misrepresentation of receipts of remote services. Quite an innocuous title, Mr Speaker, but what we see here, in fact in the commentary on the bill, the officials give the example of Luke. Now Luke is using a VPN to mask his IP address. Now Mr Speaker, tens of thousands of New Zealanders use VPNs every day. In this House, in parties opposite me, it's no doubt being used. It's quite a common and legitimate form. Now, it's concerning when you see penalties in the order of $25,000 to $50,000, commentary in public around concerns that will using a VPN itself, without trying to use it to circumvent these new GST requirements, be in fact illegal. Now, those questions have been raised. I haven't seen them answered. It would be deeply concerning because there are many legitimate uses for masking an IP address. On the student loan front, we see the government previously passed laws in this House to arrest you at the border if you're in default. Now we see them able to go to your door when the Australian government passes on your contact details. Mr Speaker, we do have concerns around this, but if I may offer a suggestion to the government, if they wanted to support student loan borrowers overseas, there's $3.2 billion outstanding. If they actually wanted to see that income come in, what they would be doing is negotiating with the Australian government for those tens of thousands of Kiwis overseas, particularly in Aussie, to pay off their student loans via their income tax in Australia. Now, I can understand why it's good for our government, maybe transactional costs for the Australian government, but if we were serious about getting some of that $3.2 billion outstanding, The most convenient way is to make sure those Kiwis working, paying tax overseas in Australia could be putting compulsory repayments into their student loan. It's been ignored by successive governments. Hands have been throwing up in the air saying it's too hard, but this would be the single most effective thing the government could do, Mr. Speaker.
So, that debate's concluded. So the debate's concluded. Members, this debate is interrupted, and I shall resume the chair at 7:30.